Hello, my name is M.W.Burnette. I am a home studio producer, songwriter, and recording artist, and this is my video diary. So today I want to talk about a bit of an uncomfortable concept, and that is evangelism. Just saying that word, just hearing that word kind of makes my blood pressure rise a little bit. It makes my muscles tense up just a little bit, and it may make you feel the same way. I know that it does a lot of people, and I want to try to understand a little bit about why that is today. So, why do we have this problem at all? Well, I guess this kind of starts with the Great Commission. As Jesus was leaving to go on to ascend into heaven, the last thing that he says in the book of Matthew is he tells his disciples, "Go into all the nations and make disciples, teaching them to observe the things that I've commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the earth." And so we have, speaking from Christian tradition, we have adopted that commission as being sort of a central tenet of our religious practices. Like we see that as a responsibility to go in and make disciples. And so what's happened, though, say within the last, I would say, 100 years, is we've kind of created a new concept of what evangelism is, and we've all been, or at least I have been, and many of us have been brought up in this kind of new version of Christianity, and with a central focus on evangelism, the evangelical movement. In my case, that's where I come from. But within that framework, you have this version of Christianity that's really kind of simplified down into just a few very general principles, and that is that God created the world, God created mankind, but each of us is a sinner. We've disobeyed God's law, and because of that, we are condemned to spend eternity in hell. But because Jesus came to earth and sacrificed himself for our sins, if we believe in that, we can be forgiven, and when we die, we'll go to heaven. And that's kind of the sum total of that particular theology. And so within that framework, kind of the purpose there is to just tell as many people as possible that narrative, get them to believe it so that they'll then be forgiven for their sins and be able to go to heaven when they die. And it sounds easy enough, but that's it's not a particularly sensitive way to communicate. And I don't think that it's a very good representation of what it is to be a Christian and what Jesus taught his followers. It was just more complicated than that. This it kind of there's a combative element, I guess you could say, to this process, this technique, if you want to call it that. There's this dynamic that's created where you have a believer and a non-believer, and the purpose here is for the believer to convince the non-believer to accept these truth claims. And if the non-believer does, then the non-believer becomes a believer, and it is then their responsibility to go in and do the same thing with other non-believers. But like I said, there was a very combative kind of relationship that's established there. I remember several years ago, I was at a retreat, and there was a speaker who was somebody said was an expert in evangelism. And he came up and basically stood in front of the crowd and berated us for about the course of an hour, just pounding on his fist and yelling and talking about the urgency of all this and telling us just how hot hell was and so on and so forth. And he was telling stories about how, he would just go into random places and talk to people, in the grocery store or waiting for a bus or whatever. And he would start these conversations like, do you know where you're going to go when you die? And nobody wants to be in that conversation. We don't want to start that conversation, and we don't want anybody else starting that conversation with us. That's just cringeworthy, right? And so when a lot of us have been taught kind of that way. And so when we hear the topic of evangelism come up, that's what we think about. And it's like, I don't want any part of that. That's awful. That's miserable. So what I want to do in this little series of videos here is to think about this in a different way. And I call this alternate sort of way of thinking about evangelism as everybody wins. So what I want us to recognize, or what I want us to try to think about differently, when we think about evangelism, let's change the goal. Let's change the objective here. And I think that this actually gets a little bit closer to what Jesus was actually talking about in the Great Commission. The goal with evangelism is not conversions. That's a very small element. It's important, I guess, in terms of Christianity. It's important, but it's not the biggest thing in all of Christianity. What I want us to focus on instead is the idea of spiritual growth. And when we think about growth, we get rid of this dynamic of this hierarchy of believer and non-believer. Instead, you have two people on equal footing who are able to share their spiritual experiences. Because, okay, and I'm speaking from a Christian perspective here, and you might not be, and that's all right. And hopefully what I'm going to say next will kind of illustrate that point. But from the Christian's perspective, it's okay for someone who is not a Christian to share their spiritual experience with you. That their spiritual experience is not invalid because it doesn't come from a Christian background. Being part of a Christian community is not a prerequisite for God to speak to you or for you to understand God in some way. And I think when we recognize that, then that gives us an extra step there, so that when we talk with other people from different religious traditions or no religious tradition or whatever, that we can respect what they have experienced and what they have learned about spiritual realities, things that we might not necessarily have learned in our own kind of limited experience of the world. So when I say that everybody wins, is when we have these interactions with people at sort of various places along this spectrum of spirituality, both parties involved in that conversation have something to gain from the other one. And I think that everything that we're going to talk about from now on starts at this point, is recognizing the validity of other people's experience and their knowledge, and the opportunity for all of us to learn from each other, and all of us collectively to grow spiritually, and for each other to help each other to grow spiritually. So let's get rid of this dynamic of one person who's in the know, who has the authority, who is then distributing knowledge to another person to, say, correct them. Let's move beyond that to a new model where everybody wins, where you have people on equal footing sharing their experience with each other so that both can grow. So that's all for right now. Thank you for sticking around, and until we meet again, stay groovy.